Hello and welcome to the podcast Fearless with Uduak Amimo. Food, photography, teaching, social enterprise, inclusion, and gender dynamics are some of the tools that my guest today uses to make the world a better place. Canadian chef Chris Klugman is the wielder of those tools, and he is my guest. Hello and welcome, Chris.
Hello, Doc. Thank you so much for inviting me to this program.
Well, thank you for accepting my invitation. Chris, we'll start with your primary profession, which is cooking. What is your earliest memory of cooking?
Yeah, I have a few early memories of cooking. I can recall when I was in grade school coming home for lunch and making grilled cheese sandwiches, which wouldn't be up to my current standard probably, but at the time I was pretty proud of my skill set.
And how old were you?
I would have been about 6 or 7.
6 or 7. Who taught you how to cook? Who introduced you to the kitchen? What made it a thing that you loved, a place that you enjoyed being?
I met somebody in university who won my heart in several ways, but through uh, a good cooking skill set and exposed me to some great cookbooks. And I pretty quickly became obsessed with cooking in general.
So, university is interesting because you go in to study physics and engineering, and then somehow meander, you take a detour. Tell us about that.
Um, yeah, the engineering physics was because I really didn't know what I wanted to do in terms of post secondary schooling. Um, I applied to 3 different universities in Ontario for 3 different subjects, one for arts, one for science, one for engineering. It turned out that the engineering, I got accepted into all of the programs, but it turned out that engineering involved a chance to live in co-ed residence. And at the time, that was an unusual situation, but I chose that over the other options.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Engineering allowed you to live where?
To live in a co-ed residence.
Co-ed. All right. So you were
So
thinking strategically, Chris, as a young man.
I think so, or maybe not. Maybe I just fell into things. But coincidentally, when I showed up at school at the university residence on the first day with my mum, um, I was greeted by a second year student who took me to my room and introduced herself. And it turned out that she ended up being my partner, my girlfriend for uh, the next several years. And she's the person who introduced me to cooking um, as a passion. She's still a very good friend.
So how then do you make the switch from studying physics and engineering in Ontario to cooking? Do you switch courses? Do you learn on the job? How does that emerge?
So I never studied cooking. I never went to school for cooking. I did end up as a professor in the local chef school eventually, but basically I was just really interested in learning everything I could about the art and science of cooking. Um, Following university, I actually rented quite a large tract of land along with a couple of friends north of Kingston, where I went to school. And they had it was in the country, and my friends had a lot of relatives who would come from the city on weekends to play. As they arrived, I collected $20 from each one of them and used that to cook for everybody. Ultimately, I really wanted to work in a restaurant, and the same friend who I met on my first day of school was working in a vegetarian restaurant in Kingston at the time and arranged for me to have a job there. Sadly, not in the kitchen, but several months later, when the owner asked me to take over management of the restaurant, I said I really was only there to get a position in the kitchen. He said, "Okay, effective today, you're the head cook."
So, okay, that's interesting. So, no formal experience of cooking. You get an opportunity to work in the kitchen. What's that like?
It was great. It was a vegetarian restaurant run by a couple of hippies. It was a very social setting. It was also by night a jazz club, and so there was a lot of music and art and interesting, talented people there. Ultimately, the restaurant was sold, and I committed to staying on for the first 3 months of the new owners, who were actually from northern India, and they taught me a lot about making Indian food during that 3 month period, which is something I've always been grateful for. When it was time to move on, I answered an ad for a sous chef at another restaurant. I didn't know what a sous chef was. Um, and the chef in the interview said, "Well, you do know how to cook with meat, don't you?" To which I said, "Yes, I cook meat all the time." And anyway, the
Was that
long
true?
at home I cooked meat. In the restaurant, I only cooked vegetarian. The Anyway, this led to an opportunity for a chef position in Kingston, but I realized in order to work at the level I was interested in, I would have to move to the city. So I moved to Toronto and got a job in what at the time was the top restaurant in the city as far as that was concerned.
Chris, you then rise to the top. You become an executive chef. What does that mean for those of us who aren't necessarily, a chef is a chef is a chef. We hear about the Michelin chefs, 5-star chefs, and what does it mean to rise to the top? Where are you in all of this in the pecking order?
So it can mean a few different things depending on the establishment. For me, I ended up working under some really good chefs and learning a lot. Um, I ended up taking a job. My first actual chef position in Toronto was at a small restaurant, about 35-seat restaurant, where I did most of the cooking and cleaning myself with limited help. Um, Over the course of time, I graduated into progressively larger venues, um, as large as the Canada's largest hotel, and there I was responsible for a staff of 130 people in the various kitchens and cleaning departments. So executive chef just basically means the top of the pecking order.
Okay. And when you say the establishments that you cooked in, my understanding is that you cooked in some of Canada's finest establishments, some of Canada's finest restaurants. Chris?
Yes, I was very lucky. I was very lucky and strategic in choosing um, where I made each career move. Did move around a lot. Basically, when I felt the learning curve was falling off, I felt it was time to move on to another situation.
Mhm. So you were lucky, you were strategic, you're also modest. I can see your discomfort with talking about some of your more successful decisions. You expand your horizons as, um, most people are asked to do, and you go into food retail, you consult at some point, you start teaching. At what point does social change become a priority for you? When does this enter your consciousness?
I've always wanted to help people, and specifically targeting those that I felt needed or could use my help. And I guess my commitment to social change started very early on. Um, when applied to the kitchen, the dynamic in kitchens has not historically been a very healthy one. It's been traditionally a fairly abusive workplace, a sexist workplace, and I did my best to try to create kitchen environments where there were opportunities for all, and particularly focused on women in the kitchen, who at the time were relegated to fairly minor roles. And and particularly with regards to how people treated each other between kitchen and front of house. And I did my best to support and promote those that I felt were at a disadvantage, whether due to gender or race or other um, challenges.
And so the question that flows from that, Chris, really is, always wanting to help people. What's happening in your childhood? Because children can be incredibly cruel, but what's happening in your childhood that means that you notice situations of injustice, inequality, inequity, and that you want to help people? What sort of parents do you have?
I had um, pretty caring parents, pretty kind parents. The the thing that stands out to me looking back on my childhood was that um, for from a fairly early age, about the age of 11 onwards, I didn't live with my parents due to the fact that we were living in uh, they were living in a remote community that didn't have an English speaking school. It was in Southwest Africa. And so I ended up living about 300 miles away from them for the next 3 or 4 years. When we returned to Canada, I I still had a lot. I still had a fair amount of independence. I moved out fairly early and never moved back home, so I was always very independent, and I was sensitive to being othered myself. I think that was really um, the experience of being bullied and being thought of as somebody different led me to want to change that for others. That's as close as I can really get to what the root cause of caring was.
Hmm. What were your parents doing in Southwest Africa? Because you're talking about Namibia.
Yeah.
And who did you live with while they were away? And why would people think that you were different wherever it was that you were?
I think it's because oh well, I was actually living with an American family that was living in the capital. My father was doing geological exploration, which is what took us there in the first place. And because um, I was from North America, not from Namibia or at the time Southwest Africa, made me different. I spoke differently. In the context of the family I lived with, there was jealousy based on me not being a member of the family, and um, so really, in a number of ways, I didn't fit in. I hadn't learned the same sports as a kid as the other kids had. In many cases, I didn't speak the same language.
So, look, Chris, not many people would think that they have a responsibility to address inequity. You notice it in the places that you work, in the kitchens. Um, Women, you talk about kitchens being abusive. What form does the abuse take, whether it's gender based, whether it's race based? How does the exclusion manifest as you're working your way through kitchens around Canada? What are you seeing?
Um, what I have seen, particularly in the past, in that, to be fair, things are evolving at this stage, but traditionally kitchens are very hierarchical. The chef is untouchable and calls all the shots, and frequently is, I mean, it's a high pressure profession, but frequently being the top of the pecking order opens the door uh, to being able to be controlling and mean and abusive. There's a lot of shouting. I'm sure you've seen shows with
Gordon
chefs.
Ramsay.
Gordon Ramsay. Gordon Ramsay's a
Mhm.
great example. He's just just very short fuse and quite intolerant. And the other thing is, traditionally, the workplace was male dominated. Um, and that, again, also is starting to change. But what this led to was the definition of roles um, for women tended to be what was termed salad girl. So you could be a salad girl, but you couldn't graduate up into the more important uh, areas of the operation, such as using the stoves. That was something that was reserved for men. Um, the abuse as well for women in particular quite often had to do with sexual abuse or innuendo. This does continue to this day. I had one of my uh, one of the women who I mentored in the kitchen ended up getting a job in Britain at the Four Seasons Hotel and was sexually assaulted in the walk-in fridge. When she went to the human resources department, they said, "What happens in the kitchen stays in the kitchen," and that's not in the distant past. That's in today's world at the Four Seasons.
Okay. Uh, I hope your friend is okay. Right.
Well, she ended
So
up getting out of
you
the kitchen.
okay.
Yeah. So, sorry.
She left the kitchen. She left cooking.
Yeah, so she left the kitchen. She got an interesting job. She ended up translating recipes to American units for Jamie Oliver, who's another well-known chef.
Okay, excellent. I was just listening to a documentary about his restaurant business. All right. So look, you make the leap from the kitchen, food retail consulting, to social enterprise. How does that happen?
The I, hmm, how does it happen? Um, I ended up working in, as you pointed out, in retail and food service, and ultimately working as a consultant to principally openings for retail operations or food service operations. In the course of one of the openings I did for third-party shareholders, um, I became aware through one of their parents of an opportunity to open a restaurant in an area of Toronto which was just undergoing gentrification or revitalization, as they like to call it. And the situation was they wanted a restaurant in this area called Regent Park, which at the time was the poorest neighborhood in the city. And the opportunity was turned down by a number of restaurateurs because it was a terrible location to put a restaurant. I saw it as an opportunity um, to reach out to some of the marginalized residents of that neighborhood. At the time, I was also teaching at George Brown Chef School, so I had the skill set to teach, and I decided to open a business which offered um, job training and career development for individuals facing barriers.
And tell us about the experience because this then becomes Paintbox, which is Canada's first B Corp. Um, what is the thinking that goes in? What do you do? How do you, what is the concept for Paintbox? And how does it feed into sustainability and social change?
There are a bunch of answers there. When you talk about sustainability, the ability of the business to sustain is one aspect of is one angle of sustainability I would look at, and it's a very tough business to make sustainable and to make profitable. In order to overcome, and all the more difficult because I was supporting employees that were facing challenges. Um, my strategy to make it work was to actually put a very large catering kitchen in. Catering is an area of food service which can be highly profitable at the high end, and I was able to create a catering operation which catered to conferences and conventions and large venue catering opportunities. This is actually how I funded the rest of the operation and how I overcame the difficulty in making a profitable operation at the same time as a social enterprise. I don't know if that answers the question. Does it?
It does. And why B Corp? What was important about the certification for you?
Yeah, so B Corp, I became aware of B Corp uh, early on in the planning of Paintbox, and part of what I wanted to accomplish by being Canada's first B Corp certified caterer was um, to actually show that I was doing that to I guess lend credence to what I was doing. So to get certification that I really was environmentally and socially ahead of the game. Um, because a lot of people say that they are there for the environment or for the people, and it's all greenwashing. So I didn't want to be thought of as somebody who's greenwashing. The other thing I did at the same time was I utilized local social service agencies to identify staff for the startup. This way, I had proof basically that I was doing what I was said I was doing. I was targeting these marginalized individuals to support in this new venture.
Tell us about the name Paintbox. It's an interesting name for a food affiliated business. Are you
Yeah,
painting the food?
yeah. Um, I actually intended to call the restaurant Regent Social, and loved the name, and was actually talked into the name Paintbox by the landlord, who at the time was not only building the restaurant but building condominiums that rose above the restaurant, and the name of it was the Paintbox Condominiums. So Paintbox was the name of the building, and it ended up being Paintbox Catering and Bistro. I did actually use Regent Social later on as the name for our event spaces.
But Paintbox suggests some sort of creativity, painting, something, something or the other. Did you do anything with that? Because I know you're a photographer.
I made up
Um, so there's some creativity to you.
I made up all kinds of reasons for it being called Paintbox, other than the fact that it was the name of the building. I like to say it had many colors. Um, it was about creativity and so on, but in truth, it was because it was the name of the building.
Okay. So you then have this strand of photography. Where does that come from? How does it intersect with your food? Um,
Yeah, I became pretty much as obsessed with photography as I had been about food previously. And it all started with me taking pictures of the food that I created. So I experimented a lot in the kitchen with shooting dishes that I was producing in the kitchen, and experimenting with light, and ultimately became a pretty good food photographer, and ended up getting demand to do food photography for other parties. At the time, it was really it was kind of a specialized niche, and it was a niche that was in demand. So I started doing food photography, and then I started to get a keen interest in portraiture. Um, I figured out that it's great to shoot food, but as soon as you have a pair of eyes in the picture, it changes everything. And so I'm quite interested in portraiture, and ended up, yeah, almost I guess almost all of what I did commercially fell into those categories. But meanwhile, I also had a photo blog, and I published a daily photo taken in usually in the line of street photography.
Uh, Chris, you've been exposed to all sorts of foods. So presumably there's the continental model. You say you like to experiment. You say that early in your career you were exposed to Indian cooking. What's your favorite um, meal to prepare? What style of food do you enjoy? What's your go-to?
Uh, um, just for myself, I tend to do a lot of cooking with Italian roots. But as far as my career went, I became very well known on very early on in the city for doing a fusion cuisine. At the time, fusion was something coming out of California. Traditional cooking had had principally come from continental Europe and kitchens I was working in. Um, but I was really interested in how California was integrating Asian ingredients and flavors, and was one of two chefs in the city who actually were doing fusion before it was a thing. So that was a lot of what my leg up was in terms of getting noticed. But yeah, I love actually all kinds of cuisine, and I'm very grateful to be able to cook all kinds. So I'm yeah, if it's just a go-to, let's make fast dinner. Maybe it's a pasta dish, but it's often something more, and I do really enjoy entertaining. I was also the first chef in Canada to be certified as a sommelier, and so I really enjoy food and wine pairing, which is something I'm pretty good at.
Okay. I look forward to experiencing your food at some point, Chris. I hope I do. I started this podcast, Fearless, in 2021 during the COVID pandemic, as we sought to reimagine the world. What was the pandemic like for you as someone, as a professional in the food business?
The pandemic here in Ontario was initiated a shutdown of all restaurants, which happened on March 15th of 2020. And at that time, I was forced by the government to close Paintbox. I laid off all my staff. There were approximately 30 people on staff, and spent the next few months alone in the business, trying to cope with the fact that I didn't have any support. So I had to do my own accounting, and I had to basically keep whatever I could keep going without having the place be open. Ultimately, I made I really thought it was going to close. I had no revenue and quite a lot of debt, and just on the verge of electing to close the business completely, I got an opportunity provided by a friend of my brother's to do a food a grocery delivery business called Nibbly. So with this new funding, I ended up bringing back some staff, um, turning the kitchens and dining rooms into warehouses, and started a food delivery business. This was a pretty good idea at the time. The big players hadn't figured it out. I actually had, fortunately, a connection through one of the funders with Uber, with the president of Uber in the States. And we started off doing our food delivery through Uber before there was Uber Eats and before Uber drivers were doing anything other than carrying passengers. This meant we could get food to the customers within sometimes as little as 15 minutes, as opposed to the big grocery players taking up to a week. Um, when the big players end up getting their act together and figuring things out, we can no longer compete on price or selection. And So at that point, I started collaborating with a number of charities here in the city to do food for hunger relief, and we did up to 5,000 meals a week mode. When pandemic restrictions started getting lifted, catering started coming back. It really looked like everything was okay, and um, then on in January of 2021, the government imposed another lockdown. At which point there was no way of moving forward, and that was how the pandemic ended Paintbox.
I lost that last part. You faded. There was a lockdown imposed in January 2021.
Yes, in January
And
2021,
then?
there was another lockdown imposed, and at that point, there was no way of moving forward, and so that's how the pandemic closed Paintbox.
So you are forced to close down your business. Presumably, you've lost quite a bit in terms of resources, the people that you have who are also going through a difficult time in terms of trying to earn a living. You have the burden of, you know, this business pretty much collapsing. What's that like for you, Chris?
Oh, I was devastated. I was, I really had such a personal attachment and commitment to the business. Um, it superseded everything else. I was just, um, I, I, during the 10 years or so that Paintbox was in operation, it was literally a 24/7 undertaking. It was almost impossible way. I stopped doing all kinds of fun things like reading or watching movies. It it was it was an all-consuming commitment. So when it was pulled out, when the rug was pulled out from under me, I felt a tremendous sense of loss, and um, it's been described to me that um, losing a business can be as devastating as losing a person. And so for the first few months, I just was numb. And what really ended up getting me through that period and into a better state was um, was my family, my friends, a lot of friends who I met online through the Responsible Leaders Network. Um, I ultimately found myself again. I found time to start reading and getting out, and um, and in hindsight, I don't think it was a terrible thing for me personally that Paintbox closed. It has opened the door to a much better life.
Yes, that's heartwarming that, I was speaking to someone else who was talking about the darkness coming with light. And, you make the point that connection and community got you through. Looking back on that experience, Chris, what would you do differently, knowing what you know now, if at all? If there were lessons to be learned from it, if someone else was navigating a similar professional journey?
Um, I think the first thing I would do differently would be my first hire would be a social worker, because in dealing with, I mean, everybody has issues, but the staff I hired at Paintbox had more than their share of issues, which is why they were hired for Paintbox. And I and some of my senior management team spent an inordinate amount of time dealing with social issues relating to the employees. So I think, yeah, social work would be the first hire. Outside of that, I don't think I'd do that much differently.
Your social justice work, Chris, finds expression in other forms. Tell us about the gender equality, equity work.
Um, well, I'm part of a group, a small group that's termed Engaging Men. It's a subset of the Gender Alliance, which is a cross network initiative um, between a number of networks like the Global Diplomacy Lab, the BMW Foundation, Bosch alumni, and so on. And this was a group of women exploring feminist issues who somebody had the idea that perhaps men should be part of these conversations. And so I was really happy to be part of the Gender Alliance subset called Engaging Men, which is a collaborative, collective journey between men and women towards gender equity. It's been a great learning experience for me being part of this group and being able to take some leadership of the group. And it's led to a lot of learnings and discussions which are pretty fascinating, not just related to feminism, but related to gender issues involving men as well. So, for example, we have explored topics like postpartum depression in men, why men commit suicide in so much larger numbers than women, and and so on. So it's it's really it's something that I really encourage others to take up, to find a small trusted group to have these discussions, because it's been incredibly rewarding to me, and I hope to those around me, in that often these discussions are taken out to the broader world.
What do you want men to learn from these engagements? What are you trying to achieve beyond involving them in the gender dynamic conversation?
I think the what men stand to gain through a lot of the gender issues which are part of our world is a greater understanding of women, and I think this is really a big issue for the world in general, is to gain more understanding of shared humanity between groups. This is, I think, the answer to solving inequity, to solving conflicts. It's really, it's very healthy for anybody to learn more and get more, um, I guess, to get more shared insight about others.
So, anyone listening to this would think that it's a very binary approach, men and women. Um, where do non binary folks fit into this conversation and these efforts?
Um, Very well, and I'm sorry if it sounds binary. It's about gender in general, and that includes all gender identities, actually.
How do you address so doing that? And you've already told us about what it looked like in your earlier career as a chef in the kitchen. How do you bring these insights together now, knowing what you know, in the work that you do, in the people that you're working with, when you're speaking? How do these show up? What's different now,
Well,
given what you know?
speaking to the general populace, I have a lot more understanding and insight, or ammunition, if you will, to make arguments for gender equity. Um, I, in terms of in terms of community support in general, my I'm no longer working full time, but I am involved in in consulting for several organizations, all of which are in support, or social enterprises in support of neurodiverse community, and so I think both what I'm doing for work and how I relate to others are very much impacted by my experience to date.
And we were talking earlier, and you said that a lot of this work also has deepened your understanding of privilege. And of course, privilege is for some people contentious. It can be uncomfortable. It can also be misunderstood. Knowing what you know now, how do you navigate those conversations? How do you make sense of the privileges that you carry, particularly given that you are working with people who are othered?
Um, well, I do try to share my privilege. I recognize it, and I I try to use it in ways that will benefit others that perhaps do not have the same privileges. Um, Certainly, it's been a growth process for me my whole life, coming from a prototypical place of privilege, being a white male in Western culture, and and thinking of myself all along as a pretty nice person. Um, I increasingly have realized over the course of time that I was a creature of my privilege, and perhaps did not always do my best for the world without even realizing it. And so I really I try as much as possible to bring benefit to others, and particularly to others who need a leg up. And I think I've been told by some philosophers that privilege cannot be given. Um, it can only be taken by force. I don't subscribe to that. I feel what I've been doing, and particularly over the course of my culinary career, I've spent a lot of time using my privilege to benefit the growth of others, and in particular, people who have been othered, including women and the color who are put into stereotypical positions normally. I'm really proud to see several of my former apprentices now as very successful chefs, um, of, of several genders and of numerous races, and I take a little bit of pride, perhaps unjustly so, but I take a little bit of pride in having been part of their journey.
And along with privilege, as a white man in the Western world, comes a deeper manifestation of expression rather, white supremacy, particularly when we talk about people of color. As you've been doing this work, what emerges for you around white supremacy, um, particularly when you're doing your best to ensure that um, people who are disadvantaged are able to access what they need to thrive?
Well, for a long time, I, like many white people, thought white supremacy was the Ku Klux Klan, and that I was just a guy. Um, that's really changed over the course of time. I totally accept the fact of white supremacy. I completely fight against it as much as I can. But I mean, when I was being very successful in my culinary career, it was uh, it was a situation that almost all the chefs that were successful were white men, and often European men. So there was even a bias against local talent. Certainly, my father was for a long time not proud of the fact that I left engineering and went into cooking until he started being recognized as, oh, Klugman, are you related to Chris? As my popularity or fame grew in the culinary world. Um, so it's a thing that needs to be accepted. Um, I think there are far few people that acknowledge white supremacy, people that acknowledge white supremacy, um, but it's certainly a fact that needs to be learned and used.
Given your work in Canada around inclusion of marginalized people, what engagement have you had with Canada's history and its oppression of Native Indigenous folk? Anything?
Um, well, it's widely acknowledged the colonialist past that has happened here. I included in my support for marginalized communities those from the Indigenous community. Um, I was actually very fortunate to have a Indigenous center just down the street from Paintbox, and to have actually a mentor. I had a mentor when I was teaching at George Brown College, who is uh, who is Indigenous, and he was very kind to me. He um, I was actually othered going into that role because I was a non full time professor, and there was a lot of resentment from the full time staff. And he took me under his wing and showed me the ropes, and we actually ended up even working together. And it was through him that I established some great connections with the indigenous community. Also through my work with a local charity called United Way, I made connections with those in the indigenous community, and it's it's a, a huge concern to me that our colonialist past has not been addressed properly yet. The government, I don't know if you realize, but has come up with a truth and reconciliation program, which has, in terms of implementation, has been very limited. So I'm extremely concerned about the state of um, Canada. I'm proud to be Canadian. I'm proud to fly the flag, but I, as much as it's a great country, we have a lot of work to do based on our history.
Chris, you've talked about being sensitive, and it's clear as I speak to you that you are a sensitive soul. Your formative experience makes you sensitive to othering. But the gifts of creativity that you have, whether it's the cooking, whether it's the photography, um, this also comes with sensitivity. How do you care for yourself given the intractable nature of the problems you're trying to solve around social injustice?
Uh, yeah, that's a really great question because there's a lot of burnout amongst those that are really concerned with um, not just injustice, but with crisis management. Um, I'm just very fortunate to have a support network around me. I've got a loving wife, unconditionally loving wife. I have friends who I value greatly, and it's really, it's less that I care for myself and more that I'm cared for by other amazing people.
What lessons can we take from your journey, Chris?
Um, I think it's really important to listen to others. I think it's really important to get to know the perspective of other people in general, um, and I think it's essential to look for opportunities to engage in dialogue and actions that are of benefit to other people.
One of the ways you do that, well, one of the several ways that you do that, which we haven't talked about yet, is through this sort of emergency service that you started. I think it was through COVID when you were trying to secure oxygen and ventilators for people. And then, I've seen action around various emergencies around the world, earthquakes, the war in Ukraine. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I can't take credit for starting my tree. I was My tree was became a thing when I was alone in my closed restaurant trying to figure out my life. But it has been a big part of my life for the last number of years. Um, I don't know whether that came through. I'm just going to say it has been a big part of my life for the last several years. For those that don't know, my tree is a platform for equitable and ethical response to planetary problems. And to that end, we have a few initiatives. One is we do an annual conference called Dream Week, which I certainly would encourage everybody's attendance at, where a number of um, opportunities for loving kindness are addressed, as well as discussion of some of the issues that are difficult to overcome. We have a weekly meeting, which allows us to discuss more short-term initiatives, and we have a program called co-budgeting, whereby the funding that we obtain can go to um, member-initiated projects of benefit to others. Um, it's really not a traditional charity, or it's not really a traditional organization in any sense. It's a platform of volunteers who really want to catch some of the issues which fall through the cracks based on other um, emergency supports, particularly.
We're coming to the end of our conversation, Chris. So, some live journaling prompts that I'm asking everyone. What are you afraid of?
I know you asked me this before, and so I've given some thought to it. And I don't think I'm afraid of very much. Um, I guess I would classify myself with some other people here who are fearless.
Well, that's why we're speaking, Chris. So, well then, if you're not afraid and you're fearless, which is amazing, and I think people listening to this would think you're amazing as well. What is your deepest fear for the world?
Climate change, and also climate change and climate change.
What's the last thing you did? Although you've told me that you're fearless, but I'll still ask you the question. What's the last thing you did that scared you?
Hmm. Um, I think it was when I was painting the back of my home, and it's quite a tall building, and I was up a very, very high ladder, and I was started being told by my family members that you shouldn't be on a ladder of that height at your age. Previously, I hadn't thought anything of it, but
What age
uh,
is that? What age is that, Chris?
I'm currently 68 years old. Um, and yeah, somebody over 60 should not be up on a ladder like that. And I was told that by my brother, by my stepmother. Um, and all of a sudden, I felt fear of being up on that ladder. It passed, but it was legitimate because so many people were telling me what I was doing was dangerous. I started to believe them, and actually, I went ahead and painted it. It was fine.
And three things in your fear busting toolkit.
Three things: um, a sense of optimism. I I feel that the worst never happens. I like to think the worst never happens. I have a strong sense of confidence in my own technical abilities, and perhaps I'm just um, naive and ignorant of what negative potential consequences could be. Oh, and I told you
Ignorance is bliss.
and I'm that I'm wino as well.
Sorry, I missed that. You're what?
I mentioned that I'm a sommelier as well, so I have an enjoyment of wine.
Yes, you did. Okay, okay. Liquid courage gets you through. I just want to check something with you, Chris. The paintbox experience during the pandemic, you lose everything, you lose your money, you're in debt. It's one of the toughest periods in your life. Having faced that, do you think that your fearlessness has to do with I've gone through this, nothing can be worse than this. I'm not afraid of anything anymore. Would you say that there's a before and an after in terms of being fearless?
Um, I guess to a certain extent, I always, I guess, uh, I always realized that paintballs could fail. In fact, I had a development consultant tell me that there'd never been a food-based social enterprise in Canada that had succeeded without government or foundation funding. So I was aware of the possibility for failure. But that being said, I I don't I don't know if it changed my fearlessness at all. I it was an acknowledged risk. I take a risk every day by getting on my bicycle in the city, um, but I can't say that my response has been fearful.
Hmm, okay. It's been wonderful speaking to you, Chris. It really has. What are you working on now? What's the next thing for a 68-year-old who still climbs up incredibly high ladders?
Um, what's next? I'm enjoying and I'm grateful for the skills and that I've acquired over the course of 68 years and utilizing them. I'm really I've been reaching out to a lot of people who I hadn't reached out to before, and so doing a lot more socializing and entertaining. And um, I'm really happy to be working on some of the initiatives that you mentioned, such as My Tree and the Gender Lens group. I'm in a really I think a good place. I keep thinking perhaps I could be saying no to opportunities, but I'm very bad at that. So I'm sure something's going to come along that I'm going to have to say yes to again. Uh, but meanwhile, it's I really I'm very grateful to be where I am right now, and still really interested in sharing that with others.
Chris, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your story with us here on Fearless.